Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, and I have with us today Sian Crossley. And Sian is a psychotherapist. She's a mom of two. She's based in the UK and is currently traveling around Southeast Asia with her family. She specializes in helping people recover after childhood trauma and is particularly interested in bringing light to the mother wound and its effects. She is the founder of Break the Cycle Coaching, which she started in 2019. Sian, thank you so much for being here. I am very excited to dig into the mother wound and bringing light to that with you today. So before we get into that, just tell us a little bit more about your story. How did you get from where you've been to here you are now in Southeast Asia talking to us?
Yeah, so well, in terms of my kind of professional journey, so I started training as a therapist 15 years ago, like a long time. I kind of first started and then took a break and then went back and this and that. And I suppose I just kind of, as I was training, I went into it just thinking, okay, I just want to help people, right? And then you have to do your own therapy. And that's when it got really interesting. And then I started, obviously kind of learning a lot about myself, my own history, my own family, which I really hadn't connected the dots before I started that training. And then, so I worked as a therapist for quite a few years in the NHS and privately as well. And then I had my daughter, so she's now nearly 5. And I just felt like I needed to do something different, something where I was still using those same skills and all of that knowledge and, all of the experience and so on, but just in a bit of a different way. So that was when Break the Cycle was born as well. She was maybe like a year old, I think. And it's been brilliant since then. And I've kind of honed in on a few core aspects of healing because it's such a big topic. I suppose it's such a journey that can take so many different routes and they're all valid. But I suppose I've honed in on the areas that have really changed things for me in a really big way. And I'm here today traveling just really because my daughter, she'll be starting school soon. So we're just wanting a bit of extra quality time really, because I then had my son. He's a year and a bit old now, and I kind of, it's tough with 2. And so I wanted to reconnect with my daughter, just a bit of quality family time, really. And so that's why we're here. And there we go.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Learning, as they say, research is really just me search, right? So learning about yourself through your own studies, that's really, it's wild too that you hadn't necessarily recognized it until you got into the psychotherapy training. So that's really beautiful. So before we jump into the mother wound, I just want to talk a little bit about the unconscious patterns that trauma survivors often get into. How does that work in the brain, and why does that happen specifically after you've gone through trauma? And what can survivors do that might be listening that are trying to kind of break some of these unconscious or even conscious patterns? We have all of these habits and things, and sometimes we're aware and sometimes not. But how do we start to recognize that so we can kind of break those unhealthy cycles?
Yeah, absolutely. So, but just kind of for a bit of a frame around that, basically in the first kind of 7 years of life, we're in a state which is really similar to hypnosis, right? So it's like a theta state. So we're taking in literally everything that we're kind of seeing, hearing, experiencing, everything we're being told about ourselves, whether verbally or not, or just in kind of behaviors, messages we're getting and so on. And so when maybe some of the experiences that we're having with especially with our caregivers, our parents, or other trusted adults, when that stuff is, we're kind of really not able to be authentically ourselves in those relationships, it's not safe to be, we then learn how to adapt, right? We learn how to cope, we learn how to kind of create a version of ourselves that is going to work in those environments, that is palatable. And so then we end up, obviously we kind of keep those going because they probably worked really well. And then, as you say, we develop these unconscious patterns, these unconscious habits, that we often don't, we don't recognize them until they stop working. But once they stop working, then actually there's going to be some part or maybe a lot of our life that's really starts to kind of break down and that really stops functioning. So, how do we recognize that? Well, obviously, anybody listening to this, I'm sure, is doing the good stuff, right? Because you're listening, you're trying to learn basically about yourself. You're trying to learn about kind of how you are functioning and why, via other people, talking about it, telling their story. And I think it's really just about never stopping questioning why you're doing something. Like that curiosity there's a way to do it without it being draining, because I think there's a risk with when we're doing this work that it's like, oh, am I not done already, like this is tiring and so on. But actually, if we find a way to just incorporate this into our experience of life, that actually growth is a part of life. That is when we're living, is when we're growing, we're progressing, we're reflecting, we're trying new things out. And the more that we do that, the more the unconscious stuff will become evident, it will become clearer more and more, and I like to use the word abstract, because I think before we've maybe, whether it's working through this stuff with a therapist, whether it's books, whether it's courses, whether it's listening to podcasts, whatever it is before that, our unconscious experience is abstract. We don't, obviously, it's unconscious, right? We don't have a handle on it. But actually, the more we get to know ourselves, the clearer it will become, how we relate to people, why we show up in relationships in a certain way, how we protect ourselves. So it's just about kind of never stopping questioning, but incorporating it in a way that is sustainable.
I love that. The curiosity is super important, because otherwise you're not going to find the awareness that you're looking for unless you start kind of hunting for it through that curiosity. So that's beautiful. So let's jump into your specialty, which is the mother wound. Before we kind of dive into the more nuances of it, can you just explain to people what the mother wound actually is?
Yeah, so there are two ways to define it. One is, so here I'm going to be talking about the personal mother wound. Okay, so there is also a collective mother wound, which I won't go into as quite as much, but the personal mother wound is the gap between what you needed from your mother and what she was able to offer. So in that gap is lies a lot of pain, really, and there is a wounding there. And another way to think of it is also that it's really the internalization of your mother's unprocessed trauma. Right, so all the stuff she couldn't quite get a handle on herself, all of the stuff that she just wasn't really able to hold and process, that would probably have found its way into the way that she mothered you, really, and into how she kind of related and how she loved. And so those are the two ways that I can describe the mother wound.
I love that. I love that second one for sure. In that second definition there, it's probably pretty common that nearly everyone has some kind of a mother wound. But at some point, this becomes a very traumatic kind of experience, to where people have, a lot of after effects of that. How does it present when it's a mother wound that actually, hinders authenticity, or presents as trauma, or possibly, is abusive in those younger years? How does that present for people that are carrying this mother wound?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, everybody manifests things in a slightly different way. But generally speaking, the mother wound really kind of affects self-worth. So anything kind of relating to your sense of yourself. And the reason for this is because often we, as you say, pretty much everyone has some sort of mother wound to some extent, right? Obviously, mothers are just women doing what they can, right? That's all, that's it. Humans, and yeah, and especially historically, there just wasn't the access to the kind of amazing research and resources and stuff we have now, right? But when we get so we can differentiate a bit, okay? Because there are kind of experiences of one's mother that have not been ideal, but that we can manage and work through. And then we do move up towards, I say, the more kind of abusive end, maybe narcissistic mothers and so on, right? So we kind of of course, the effects of that are different, but the commonality is that it's around self-worth, because often when somebody's experienced a mother wound, it means that there's been either a significant amount of enmeshment with your mother, meaning that you've not been able to really develop yourself fully, properly, separately from her, or sometimes the opposite, right? There's been too much distance, and so therefore you've not had that experience of having the lovely kind of mirroring that we need from our mothers in order to develop, really. So it's self-worth, and how that presents itself, or rather how, what somebody does in order to manage feeling unworthy, basically feeling like they're not okay or not good enough, that varies. That could be perfectionism. That could be, body image issues is really common one with the mother wound, or just not even body image, so just kind of appearance issues or fixation on kind of how you're looking, how you're presenting to the world, if you like. Perfectionism and anxiety, kind of really trying to get it right, which is always linked to that feeling of course, of not being good enough. So there are lots of different ways in which it can look, but it's perfectionism commonly, it's appearance issues, it's anxiety, and it's kind of stuff relating to self-worth and self-esteem.
This self-worth going very, very deep here in that, and obviously like you said, the mother wound really being on a spectrum, because there's like that other side where it's, what the coin term is good enough parenting, the good enough mothering that's over here, all the way to, being absolutely rejected or abandoned, by a mother. What is it specifically? Because we know, and we're not going to discuss too much about the father wound, but we also know that there's a new coined term of the father wound as well. The impact of the mother wound being on the self, the one who experienced it. Is that like a more of a biological link, a psychological link? Is it because of the depths of, being, in utero for 9 months with the mother? Is there just a stronger connection there? And that's why it actually comes back at the person and their self-worth. How does that actually work psychologically?
Yeah. So because and so with the mother wound, it can affect men, but it does tend to, I don't want to dismiss men who have had really painful relationships with their mother, because it's valid and it's painful, but I guess it's maybe useful for me to talk now about in terms of kind of daughters and mothers, right? Because it does tend to hit a bit harder. And the reason for that, and it feeds into everything you just mentioned there, and kind of why it affects this, our forming of our sense of self, is because when a mother, especially has a daughter, especially if that mother has not done much work on herself, let's say, she is then going to be projecting so much stuff onto that daughter, so much of the stuff. So typically it starts off with in utero, in pregnancy, and normally in that baby phase, it's an idealized way. Okay, so it's like this is like a new chance for me, right? This is what's happening unconsciously for the mother. This is like so I'm rubbish, but she's perfect, right? She's new and shiny and brilliant and wonderful, and she's going to be everything I couldn't be. She's going to be everything I can't be. Okay, and that's wonderful, and I love it. And then the daughter gets older, and starts wanting to separate, starts wanting to be their own person. And that then it flips. So then it's, okay, so she's all the bad parts of me, right? Or she's or commonly, you know, the mother wound gets really tricky around adolescence, because then the mother with the unprocessed pain, that maybe if there's narcissism there, there's kind of that emptiness there, you know, she's seeing her adolescent daughter go out and live and thrive and, you know, whatever, get a good response from the world maybe. And so then it becomes that kind of jealousy and the attacking and the projection and so on. So throughout either process, does that make sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So throughout either process, whether it's idealizing baby or infant or toddler, or it's, you know, jealous of 15-year-old daughter, either way, the daughter is experiencing that love purely in relation to the mother's wounds. Right? It's not, that daughter's not ever experiencing a healthy distance, a love that is at a healthy distance, right? Because, you know, love is not a possessive thing, really. You know, it's about kind of, there's a healthy separation, but there's also obviously with mothers and daughters where it kind of works and things flow. Then there's a closeness as well, but it's managed with boundaries, right? But when there's mother wounding, there's not so many boundaries. And so then the development of self for the daughter is just really interfered with. So there's just all of these points in which she will pick up on this stuff. So then it's, okay, I need to keep myself small so mum's okay. I need to make sure I'm not, you know, this is unconscious, of course, but, you know, I'm not doing too much, or I don't do too well, so that, you know, I don't upset mum. Oh, but also I probably need to do really well to impress mum, or she gets cross, you know. So but either way, it's always just this, I can't quite just kind of be me. There's this editing constantly that has to happen in order to kind of maintain the mother-daughter relationship. So yeah, so then self-worth, you know, then we end up in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and, you know, we kind of don't quite know who we are without someone else's gaze, without someone else's critique, without having to please someone else. We kind of we haven't had that experience.
Yeah. And it feels like a lack of safety to the brain, right? Because the brain is just constantly trying to keep you alive and safe. And so if that's what it knows that love feels like, it's going to continue. And there's probably a lot of repeated patterns for people who have grown up. You know, it's funny because you're talking about the mother's wounding affecting and wounding the child, right? So it's like my mother's wounding wounded me, right?
Right.
And these conflicting you know, nuanced messages that you're getting subconsciously from her, that you're either too good, or that you're not enough, or that there's not an actual proper mix in between, and I can't be close to you, or I want to be super close to you. These conflicting messages, you know, they translate to other relationships as well, because that's just kind of it's a learned type of love. And I think there's a waking up process that comes when you realize that's very conditional love. So now it's, you know, how well I hit my milestones as an infant and how small I stay as a teenager, or vice versa. That's what love is. And it's very conditional based at that point, because you're really just trying to fill an emptiness inside of the mother who's wounded. This all sounds quite negative and difficult and challenging. What would you say before we give people hope? Because I definitely want to jump into hope of how they can move forward. But what is the most challenging thing when clients are coming to you to work on this mother wound? What's the biggest challenge that they're facing?
So there's two. One can be if they're still in a relationship with their mother, often that's an if, you know, often that relationship is still so draining and taking up an enormous amount of psychological space and resources and energy. So then it's kind of obviously kind of healing the wound whilst managing that relationship, which is sort of obviously overlaps. It's kind of one of the same in some ways. But I think, yeah, at the core of it, people are generally struggling with this. It sounds vague, but it also is at the nub of it, is this not good enough feeling that's just kind of swirling around everything, career, relationships, everything. And I think also just the grieving part of it, which I think can be overlooked sometimes, is the enormous amount of sadness and, you know, real loss at what could have been. You know, is what might it have been like if I had a supportive mum, if I had a mum that understood what I meant, or that listened to me, or etc., etc. And so then it's about kind of moving through that. And of course you can move through that. You know, we are designed to grieve. Humans are grieving all the time about something, and we can do it well when we let ourselves. So it's kind of helping people through that process.
Yeah, I mean, there's such an, you know, if the mother is still alive, whether or not you have contact or not, it's a very ambiguous loss that the world doesn't understand unless they have a similar mother wound. And is that kind of a prerequisite for finding real healing and kind of reestablishing your self-worth and your place in the world? Do you have to kind of go through that grieving?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that is yeah, because if we don't grieve for something that we've lost, then we're kind of stuck. You know, you can't really move forward fully, and that is irrespective of what your relationship with your mother looks like in the moment. It could be your no contact, it could be you speak every day, it could be she's passed away. You know, the mother wound is really not about your mother when you're an adult, if that makes sense. You know, by that point, it's you know, it's yours to kind of work through. And so the healing part is not actually anything to do with her. You know, the grieving needs to happen, I would say, in order to be able to kind of accept and then move forward.
Yeah. So how do we offer people a few steps here who might be listening, going, this sounds like me. Wow, maybe that's why I struggle with my self-worth. I'd really like to move forward. This episode may have brought some awareness to some of those unconscious things in their life. So what would be some steps for them to kind of move into a space where they can start to accept and start moving into grief and start doing that healing work for themselves?
Yeah. So because this is something that I've worked through myself. I've healed my own mother wound. It's something also I've helped a lot of clients with, a lot of people with. And so I've developed this sort of 4-step process, just that for me, hopefully it will be helpful for your listeners as well, just to provide some kind of structure and containment, I suppose, because this can feel so big, you know, this can feel, and it is big, and it is a deep, painful thing, but there's always something that can be done to improve how we're feeling, always. So the first stage, as I say, it's a kind of 4-part process. The first is getting really, really clear on how you experienced your mother, particularly as a child. Also now, if you're in contact with her as well, that's fine. But we're really thinking about when your brain was forming, what were you experiencing from her? So, and this needs to happen without all of that, oh, but I'm betraying her, or I'm being ungrateful. She did so much for me. I'm being disrespectful, all of that stuff, all of the guilt is actually part of the mother wound, right? That probably will have shown up in the relationship somewhere. There probably will have been quite a heavy layer of guilt somewhere along the line, right? So it's part of the mother wound. So we acknowledge the thoughts. Obviously, we never try to get rid of them, because then they get sticky and really stay around. We just kind of let them be. But we have to get really clear on how we experienced her. So just kind of understand really what that relationship felt like, what some of those dynamics were, writing stuff down if you can. Just kind of really getting that clear in your mind. Then moving on to the grieving and the acceptance part. And that doesn't mean forgiveness. So my personal opinion is that you don't have to forgive in order to move on. I've seen many people who, some things are unforgivable, and that's it, and that's okay. But the grieving needs to be done, the acceptance of this is how it is, this is how it's been, this has been my experience with my mother in this lifetime, or in this, in my childhood, however you want to think of it, that we have to kind of be able to do that. And in terms of how to grieve, obviously that's complex, but really we're designed to do it when we allow ourselves, when we give ourselves a space, when we support ourselves enough, and we focus on it, we bring it to mind, and we let the feelings in, then we grieve naturally. And then once we've done the kind of understanding, the grieving and acceptance part, which obviously is a bit of it can keep going. It's not as linear as I'm describing it. But then
definitely not.
No, right. No. But then but I do find in this order can feel a bit containing, that we're sort of roughly thinking about it in this way. So it doesn't feel like too much at once.
Yeah.
We've done, and then we kind of we basically have space then to start becoming our own mother. And, that's when we can really move forward in huge ways, because, and this is also, that's a skill for life then, that we are mothering ourselves, we are learning how to really nurture ourselves, how to offer ourselves comfort, how to offer ourselves healthy boundaries and advocate for ourselves, and hold ourselves to account with compassion, and all of this stuff that we need from our mother, we can offer ourselves. It's entirely possible to do. And then that all forms a really nice foundation for really kind of living life in a very intentional way, in the way that you want to, basically, in a way that kind of fits for you, that is not a life lived with your mother's, what you're going to think of this in your head, and that lingers sometimes for a lifetime. You can be there, right? Like, what would she think of this? Oh, she wouldn't like it. And even if you still do the thing, just the fact that the thought is there, it's like, we don't need that there. Like, let's, once we go through this process of healing this wound, then that voice just her voice won't be there.
Living life on your own terms, what you weren't able to do in your infancy or your childhood or your teenage years. Absolutely. You get to kind of go back and conquer that and live back on your terms, and take that authenticity back that you weren't able to express or experience when you were younger. Yeah, I love that. Sharon, thank you so much. This has been so informative, and I think it's going to help a lot of people who are listening, even just to start connecting some of their own dots. So I always ask all of my guests, in your personal healing journey, what were some of the important resources that were really impactful in your healing?
Okay, so for me, when I was first kind of starting out, I'm really into my books, and so a couple here. Let me just check the right title. Okay, so Bethany Webster.
Okay.
She is brilliant. She does a lot of mothering stuff. She has a book called Discovering the Inner Mother.
Okay.
And also this was when I was pregnant with my daughter, which was incredibly triggering. So I read a book called Mothering Without a Map, which is by Catherine Black, which was really helpful. And also it was, it's accessing therapy, and I think just kind of, using all of the resources, I guess I would in general in healing, whether that's other books or podcasts and so on, but also just with it through the lens of the mother wound, right? I was always kind of holding in mind, like, oh, this is like the core lots of it. This is the thread that if I pull is going to unravel lots. But yeah, those two books were brilliant, and accessing really trauma-informed therapy was really good.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us today. Tell people where they can find you, where they can find your work, how they can reach out to you if they have more questions on this topic.
Absolutely. So I am mainly on Instagram. So my Instagram is breakthecycle_coaching. I've got a mother wound course on there. So it's specifically, it's literally just focusing on obviously healing the mother wound, and it kind of guides you through that process that I just mentioned there. Also my website, which is breakthecyclecoaching.co.uk. And yeah, my other courses and so on are there, and my email contacts and everything. So yes, hopefully this has been useful for your listeners.
Beautiful. Thank you again so much. I'm going to have all that we talked about today, all of the links in the show notes below. And I'm sure people will reach out with more questions. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Sharon. Have a great rest of your, for you, night, because you're out far away. But enjoy your evening. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow. For any information that was discussed in this podcast episode, check out the show notes below. Until next time, be well.